He wore the uniform of his country, the ribbons of 2 decades of service pinned over his heart. But none of it mattered. On a quiet stretch of road, in the land he had sworn to protect, an Army lieutenant colonel was shot by the very people entrusted with upholding the law. One mistake, born not of fear, but of something far older and uglier, ignited a fire no one could contain. Within hours, the Pentagon knew. Within days, the nation could not look away. And when the truth surfaced, when the full weight of honor collided with the cruelty of prejudice, the reckoning that followed shook the country to its core. Before we reveal how one man's silent sacrifice exposed a system's deepest cracks, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And stay with us, because what happened after that gunshot wasn't just about justice. It was about a nation being forced to see itself in the mirror. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed never set out to be a hero. Raised in a small town, stitched together by cracked sidewalks and quiet pride, he grew up believing that service wasn't about glory. It was about responsibility. His father, a mechanic who fixed school buses by day and coached Little League by night, taught him early that real strength was silent. His mother, a nurse who stitched wounds and wiped tears in the same long shifts, showed him that dignity wasn't something the world handed you. It was something you carried, even when the world refused to see it. At 18, Marcus had stood on a cracked asphalt stage and taken an oath to defend a country that still debated whether men like him fully belonged. He served through 2 wars, countless deployments, and 1,000 silent sacrifices the headlines never mentioned. Bronze stars, commendations for valor, letters of thanks from presidents, they lined the walls of a modest home he rarely had time to visit. Yet through it all, Marcus knew a deeper truth. The uniform could command respect, but it could never erase suspicion. He learned to move carefully through airports, to lower his voice when strangers tensed, to offer a smile before anyone could offer fear. The battlefield was simple compared to the fragile dance of returning home. When he finally rotated back to the States after his latest deployment, he looked forward to blending into the ordinary again. Morning jogs, coffee in battered mugs, weekends spent fixing up an old motorcycle in his garage. He wasn't looking for battles anymore, but sometimes he would realize later, the battle finds you anyway. On a day like any other, wearing the very uniform that symbolized his promise to his country, Marcus Reed climbed into his pickup truck, clipped his ID to the dashboard, and set out toward a town that had never learned to recognize the face of its own defenders. He never saw the checkpoint coming, and he never imagined that in the country he had bled for, his uniform would not be enough to protect him. The road into town curved gently between fields of dry grass and aging oaks, the kind of sleepy stretch where time itself seemed to slow down. Marcus Reed drove with one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel, his uniform catching the afternoon light through the cracked windshield. His duffel bag sat in the back seat, still dusty from base life. His official military ID clipped clearly to the dashboard for anyone to see. The checkpoint appeared almost out of nowhere. A hastily erected barricade, a few orange cones, and 2 local police cruisers parked at awkward angles, their lights flashing lazily against the bright sky. It didn't look official. It didn't even look necessary. But Marcus, a man who lived by codes older than flags, slowed his truck without question. He pulled up to the first officer, a man in dark sunglasses whose hand hovered a little too eagerly near his belt. There was no friendly wave, no easy nod of greeting, the kind given to other men in uniform without a second thought. Instead, there was a pause, a squint, a silent sizing up that Marcus had felt too many times before. "License and registration," the officer barked. His tone clipped, as if daring Marcus to challenge him. Marcus reached slowly toward the glove compartment, announcing every movement like he had been trained to do, not on battlefields abroad, but on streets back home. "Reaching for my papers, sir," he said evenly, but the officer didn't relax. A second one approached from the passenger side, his posture rigid, his hand already unsnapping the holster of his weapon. Marcus could feel it, the shift in the air, electric and wrong, as if the rules of gravity themselves had changed. Despite the uniform, despite the ID, despite every ribbon and medal that should have screamed ally, not enemy, the suspicion in their eyes only grew. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, sharp against the thickening silence. Marcus kept his hands visible, his voice steady, every inch of his body trained toward de-escalation. But when you are seen only through the lens of fear, sometimes even your caution looks like a threat. And in that heavy, fragile moment, the future tilted on the edge of a single breath. The moment Marcus's fingers brushed the edge of his glove box, everything unraveled. "Gun! He's reaching!" one of the officers screamed, panic lacing his voice louder than the truth could ever be. The world exploded. Before Marcus could even raise his hands higher to show the empty air, before he could even open his mouth to plead reason, the first shot cracked across the quiet afternoon. It hit him low in the side, a blinding bolt of heat that stole his breath and folded his body inward. Another shot followed, then another, ripping through the dusty air, shattering not just bone and muscle, but something far more fragile. The illusion that uniform and loyalty could shield him here. Marcus crumpled to the pavement, the worn black of his boots scraping against the asphalt. His military jacket, pressed sharp that morning with quiet pride, bloomed dark with blood. His medals, the ones pinned with ceremony by generals and presidents, clattered hollowly against the ground. The officers shouted conflicting orders over his fallen body, hands still raised in a useless, desperate gesture of surrender. "Don't move! Show your hands! Stay down!" Marcus couldn't move. His world narrowed to the feel of the hot pavement burning against his cheek, the metallic tang of blood flooding his mouth, the roar of his own heartbeat thundering against a sky that seemed impossibly far away. Around them, life did not freeze. Bystanders from nearby shops ran forward, some shouting, some filming, their phones trembling in furious hands. A woman screamed. Someone yelled, "He's military!" Look at his uniform. But it was too late. The damage was done. The badge that should have protected him had turned against him. The flag he had fought for had not seen him. The law he had sworn to defend had failed him in the place he should have been safest. And somewhere in the dizzy blur of pain and betrayal, as Marcus fought to stay conscious, he knew. This wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable crash of a system that had never fully seen men like him as its own. The sirens came first, shrieking through the small town streets with a frantic urgency that could not drown out the sickening stillness left behind. Officers swarmed the scene, cordoning off the checkpoint with yellow tape that fluttered limply in the unforgiving breeze. But no barrier could contain what had already been unleashed. The bystanders didn't leave. They stayed, phones raised, voices trembling with outrage, some whispering prayers, some screaming accusations. Within minutes, raw video footage flooded social media. A soldier, gunned down in full uniform, lying crumpled like discarded cloth on the street he was supposed to be honored on. Screens lit up across the country. News alerts interrupted television broadcasts. first in local chatter, then national headlines, then, ominously, the Pentagon. When the Defense Secretary was briefed, the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. A decorated Army lieutenant colonel shot without warning, without reason, without cause, in his own country, by those sworn to protect him. In the quiet war rooms of Washington, D.C., where decisions about nations were made with measured hands, fury rose like a tide that could not be held back. Senior officials pored over the footage, frame by frame, their faces hardening with every detail revealed. There was no weapon in Marcus Reed's hand. There was no threat. There was no excuse. Statements began to pour in, not from the town's police department, but from military leaders, senators, veterans' organizations. This is not justice. This is not who we claim to be. This cannot be buried. And for the first time in years, it wasn't just activists crying out. It wasn't just broken families. It was the Pentagon itself, the most guarded institution in the world, standing with a man it refused to let be forgotten. The officers responsible for the shooting were placed on immediate administrative leave, but it was too late for quiet resolutions. The story had escaped into the bloodstream of the nation, and it was moving faster than any spin machine could contain. Marcus Reed's name was no longer a name. It was a reckoning. The official statement from the Pentagon wasn't delivered by a spokesperson behind a curtain of vague language and political half-measures. It came directly from the Secretary of Defense, flanked by generals whose ribbons told silent stories of wars fought under every sky. "We are aware of the incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed," he began, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood of anyone listening. "And let me be absolutely clear. We will not stand by while a decorated officer of the United States Army is treated as an enemy on American soil." The room crackled with the weight of his words. Within hours, the Department of Justice opened a federal civil rights investigation. Uniformed military investigators, JAG officers with no patience for small-town politics, arrived at the local precinct, demanding full access to body cam footage, radio communications, and personnel files. There were no friendly handshakes, no private negotiations, only the relentless clinical precision of a machine that had decided it would no longer tolerate rot in the walls of its own house. Meanwhile, in cities across the country, veterans marched in uniform, medals pinned proudly to their chests, holding photos of Marcus Reed. Signs appeared outside courthouses, "Protect all who serve." Not in our name. Reporters surrounded the town's police chief, who stumbled through a hastily prepared statement filled with words like misunderstanding and procedural review, words that sounded pitiful against the roar of national fury. But it was too late. The footage was everywhere. The truth was undeniable, and the Pentagon had drawn its line in the sand. Behind closed doors, federal prosecutors drafted charges faster than anyone thought possible. Obstruction of justice, excessive use of force, civil rights violations under the color of law. The officers who had drawn their guns on Marcus Reed were no longer just facing angry tweets or bad headlines. They were facing the full weight of a nation's betrayed promise and the iron will of an institution that would not let their betrayal stand. Justice was no longer a hope. It was a certainty moving toward them like a tidal wave. And nothing, not badges, not excuses, not silence, could stop it. The courtroom was packed the day the verdicts came down, not with the usual murmurs and shifting of impatient crowds, but with a heavy, reverent silence. Veterans in full-dress uniforms filled the pews. Families, clutching miniature flags, sat shoulder to shoulder. Reporters jostled quietly at the back, their cameras aimed like witnesses too humbled to speak. The officers who had pulled their triggers that day sat at the defendant's table, their uniforms stripped of honor, their faces hollow masks of regret or fear. Maybe both. The judge's voice cut through the tension like a blade. On the charges of excessive force, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice, guilty. One word, one syllable. Yet it felt like the ground itself shifted beneath the weight of it. Outside, the bells of a nearby church rang, their notes spilling into the streets like a hymn for a justice long delayed but not denied. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed sat quietly near the front of the courtroom, dressed once again in uniform, this time with his medals gleaming sharper than ever under the courtroom lights. His side still ached. His scars still burned. But he sat tall, unmoving, the embodiment of dignity unbroken. When the session adjourned, a small ceremony took place not on the battlefield, but right there, in the place where he had been wronged. In front of gathered officials, the Secretary of Defense personally presented Marcus with a special commendation for courage and dignity beyond the call of duty. And then, one by one, the veterans in attendance, men and women of every color, creed, and corner of the nation, rose silently to their feet and saluted him, not because protocol demanded it, not because tradition required it, but because he had reminded them all that honor isn't worn, it's carried, and even when the country fails its promise, those who live by its highest ideals can never truly be defeated. Later that month, a plaque was installed at the checkpoint site, in memory of those who serve with honor and stand even when their nation falters, in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed. The asphalt, where blood once pooled, now bore the silent promise that the world had changed, because one man refused to stay silent. Sometimes, the greatest battles are not fought overseas, but here, in the silent spaces where dignity meets prejudice. Sometimes, the strongest act of courage isn't charging into danger, but standing calmly in its aftermath, refusing to let cruelty define you. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed didn't need to shout his worth. He didn't need to rage. His life, his sacrifice, and his unbreakable dignity spoke louder than any verdict ever could. In a world too quick to forget its promises, sometimes it takes one man's pain to remind a nation what honor is supposed to mean. Have you ever stood your ground when it would have been easier to fall? Have you ever chosen dignity when the world offered you anger? Share your story below and stay with us for more true moments where silent strength shapes the future, and justice, no matter how long delayed, still finds its voice.